So good morning, afternoon, evening. So welcome to our fifth of our special webinar series on the impact of the pandemic on women and girls in the Global South. This series aims to engage researchers, policymakers, and practitioners on matters around women's empowerment and the impacts that the pandemic and the associated economic crisis has had on women in the Global South. So today we will address the implications that COVID-19, the crisis, the school closures, the lockdowns, the impacts that those have had on girls' education. We've seen from previous economic shocks as well as pandemics from the past that investment in education is disproportionately reduced for girls relative to boys, especially among poor and the most vulnerable populations. So to the extent to which many of these girls may not return to school once they open up again, this will have potentially very long-lasting effects on their future earnings and well-being, as well as that of their children. And so we will hear today from four panelists, experts in these areas, who will speak to us about both recent empirical trends, but also some policy issues and some practical solutions. The Women's Empowerment Lab in Development Lab at McGill is immensely grateful for the support of Canada's International Development Research Centre through its growth in economic opportunities for women, GROW. So GROW, for those of you who might not know, is a 5-year action research program jointly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and IDRC, in order to find scalable solutions for advancing gender equality in the world of work. Working with partners in East Africa, the program focuses on 3 particular areas, and of course we at the lab are taking a more global perspective, but the focus is very much on these themes with the GROW program: addressing gender segregation in employment, reducing and redistributing unpaid care work, and unleashing women's collective agency. So while we were meeting virtually, the series and the lab are hosted by McGill University, which is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands on which we meet today, and the lands and the waters on which we meet today. So just a quick reminder of today's run of show. We have 4 experts who are going to be presenting for about 15 minutes each. After that, we will have a moderated question and answers session, and then I invite those of you in the audience to use the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions in that space. So without further ado, I'd like to now move to present our first speaker. Our first speaker is Jaime Saavedra, who leads the Global Education Global Practice at the World Bank Group. Before he served as Minister of Education of Peru from 2013 through 2016. And throughout his career, Mr. Saavedra, a Peruvian national, has led groundbreaking work in the areas of poverty and inequality, employment and labor markets, the economics of education, and monitoring and evaluation systems. So Jaime, I'll leave the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you very much for the invitation and for having me. I'll try to use definitely less than the 15 minutes. But wanted to start emphasizing that this is a really extraordinary crisis, and sometimes I don't think that everyone, all policymakers, and society in general are internalizing the magnitude of the crisis for the education sector. We have never lived something like this, in which we have these twin shocks, right? In which we have extended school closures, not of a few weeks, but of many months. Different in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere. In the Northern Hemisphere, we have the summer in the middle, which some can see that is kind of a cushion in which, systems can try to see what to do. In the Southern Hemisphere, in which the school year tends to be between, say, February, March, and the end of the year in December, this crisis is hitting in the middle of the school year. So it's just plainly 5-6 months that already kids are losing, and it could be longer. So in addition to that extended school closures, we have a deep economic recession, right? Precisely in the moment in which we said, well, now we need to do a lot of investments in order to recover the time lost, and make sure that kids do not drop out of school, etc. We have a huge economic crisis everywhere in the planet, right? I'm talking about deep recession, probably the deepest recession, even larger than the 2008, 2009 recession. So we have had those type of shocks in the past. We have had school interruptions. We have had economic recessions with impacts on public budgets and in family budgets, but we have never did have the two things at the same time. And in addition to that, if you look at this from a financial perspective, it's kind of a triple shock, because we have potential reductions in budgets, in public budgets, that we'll need to discuss on how to ensure that that doesn't happen. We have definitely reductions in family disposable income that can go to education. And third, given that this shock is happening everywhere in poor and rich countries, international aid might also be compromised. So even a country that says, look, I want to stick to my 0.7% of GNI going to ODA, to development assistance, it will be a 0.7% of a smaller GNI. So it's a double shock to education with a triple shock on the financing side. So this is really an unprecedented shock to education. And we have started to calculate the potential size of the impacts on education outcomes. Economists, I think, are very bad at predicting stuff and predicting the exact magnitude, right? But we can simulate at least, right? And with the first simulations that we have done at the World Bank is pointing out that for the countries, for about 80 countries for which we have PISA data, the percentage of children who would have the minimum standards in math and reading can go. So the kids who get that standard, who do not get the standard, the minimum standard can go up from 40 to 50%. So it's a 10-point increase in the percentage of kids who might not get the minimum standards in reading. Simulations in terms of dropout rates signal that with the last forecast of the World Bank and the IMF in terms of the size of the recession, we could be seeing at least 7 million children out of school that will not come back to school. The latest estimates of Save the Children point out that number could be 10 million. And we know that girls are 2.5 more times likelier that dropping out of school than boys. And in terms of potential foregone earnings because of the reduction in learning and because of the less years of schooling, potentially there is, in an intermediate scenario, each child and young person from this generation might be losing $16,000 in net present value during their lifetimes. Those $16,000 per student amounts to a loss of $10 trillion for this generation, which is we compare it to global GDP is about 8% of global GDP, which is a huge number. So we need to really internalize the magnitude of this crisis. And I've talked about foregone earnings, I've talked about potential dropout rates. We know as well that school nutrition might be affected. 350 million kids have their main meal at school, and that has been partially, replaced by cash transfer programs or other ways of delivering food in some countries, but not completely. And I'm not talking about the impacts of this will have on mental health. Now, that I would like to discuss a little bit more. Now, the question is, can the effects on girls and women education prospects be larger? And the answer is yes, which may sound counterintuitive, given that the prevalence of the coronavirus is the same for both genders, and that men with COVID-19 are more risk for worse health outcomes and death, right, independent of age. However, I'm not talking here about morbidity and mortality, right? I mean, there's much more to the story. Our sense is that, in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic might impact negatively girls in schooling and learning much more than boys. There will be a bigger scar on girls and regarding mental health, and girls face higher risk of violence, sexual exploitations, adolescent pregnancy as a consequence of this pandemic. So even within the issue of learning and schooling, there might be a larger impact on girls, and in addition, there are other mechanisms through which girls might be more harmed by this crisis than boys. Now, I'm going to unpack quickly some of the issues I mentioned. So first, why is that school closures can put girls at risk of falling behind in their schooling and learning? And these things has not happened completely yet, of course, right? But there's historical global evidence, right? We need to start with the fact that we know that the burden of care work tends to fall disproportionately on women and girls, right? According to the ILO, women do 3 times as much more unpaid care work than men. And COVID brings with it a potential increase in caregiving responsibilities due to the increased likelihood of needing to look after young siblings or sick family members. And as unpaid care work increases with COVID, girls will likely bear the burden, so they will have less time to devote to any type of educational engagement, both during and after the lockdown. Now, even without family members to care for, there seems to be a differential in what is access to remote learning. Now, when I say that this school closures will have an impact on learning, obviously it's not that countries are standing still. Countries are implementing different types of multi-platform remote learning activities in order to try to mitigate the negative impact of the crisis. So we do see in most countries, right, that they are investing more in technology, online material, online classes in a few cases, radio, TV, etc., which is fine. I mean, that's important. It's important that countries are trying to mitigate as much as they can, with obviously very different degrees of success across the world, and even within each country, very different degrees of success depending on a family that has resources versus a family that does not have resources. But even if the family has some resources, so they could have access to a laptop or to a smartphone, which is now critical to receive some educational content, we do see that even in those cases, gender norms will play a role in investment decisions, and there will be gender differences in the resources available at home, right? And I mean, if there is only one device, or less devices than the number of children, there is the likelihood that girls will have less access than boys. So that the issue of access to technology, even when there is some access within the household, is a critical issue, right? And so the intra-household allocation of ICT resources may be a critical issue for girls. And then finally, on the educational side, something talking strictly about the education channels. When school reopened, many girls will likely not return to school, and we see that in boys as well. And there will be different channels, but some evidence of the past points out that this might be a larger impact for girls. Ebola is the closest crisis that we have faced in terms of length, effect on the economy, and impact on social interaction. And what we see is that in Sierra Leonean villages that were heavily disrupted by Ebola, the school enrollment rates for adolescent girls fell from 50 to 34%, much larger than with boys. Evidence we see also, for instance, in the case of rural Ethiopia, when there was a coffee price shock after the 2008 global financial crisis, and that increased the school dropout probability of children by nearly 8%, while that number was 13% in the case of girls. So the dropout rate potential is the other mechanism that worry us tremendously. And the other um, uh, um, area that I wanted to discuss a bit was the issue of how school closures will likely be associated with increased violence. So lost jobs, working from home while caring for children, all can increase the risk of mental health problems for parents. Stressful situations may increase the risk of violence and child abuse. With the preventive closures that we have seen as in the context of this pandemic, there has been an increase in police intervention for domestic violence cases. Google searches for domestic violence have already increased dramatically. A national assessment supported by World Vision revealed that beatings by parents and or guardians have increased by 42%, and that there was a 40% increase of calls to the child helpline in Bangladesh during the lockdown that we're still living. Something similar we see in Ukraine, for instance, where the number of calls to the national hotline on combating domestic violence has increased by 26% just in the first 2 weeks of the quarantine. And all this evidence that we're starting to see are unlikely an underestimation, as domestic abuse victims, as we know, are more afraid to call for help, particularly when you have a potential abuser right in the next room. World Vision estimates that between 53 and 85 million children could have experienced violence over the 3-month period of the lockdown. And then finally, the other point I wanted to make is that given that most sexual violence against girls tend to be at home or in the community, obviously the fact that girls are not in school, right, implies that school closures will place girls at higher risk. Now, we're not saying that that school violence that violence against girls is not happening in school. It is, right, and it's happening at unacceptable levels in many countries. So it's something that we really need to combat. But still, in many places, the school tends to be a safer place, right, for girls to thrive. Again, in the case of Sierra Leone, for instance, trying to see past evidence, 55% of children interviewed after Ebola said that they thought sexual violence against children in their community had risen during or after the epidemic. Now, if we go to what the evidence that we're seeing today, again, UNFPA estimates that if the lockdown continues for 6 more months, easily 31 million gender-based violence cases will occur. In Kenya, the Chief Justice reported that in just the first 2 weeks of April, there was a 35% increase in gender-based violent cases and a 50% increase in violence against girls. In South Africa, the president has already come out publicly, extremely worried about an increase in violence against women. So this is another key factor, right? That might have an impact on girls' health and welfare. That will also have an increase in teenage pregnancy, which in turn, if there is an increase in teenage pregnancy, that will have an impact in terms of those girls not going back to school. So will have an additional impact in terms of their future human capital accumulation. So all these, however, are things that we can do something about, right? So we are now still in the middle of the pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. When are we going to come out of this? This is not going to be a non-linear. This will be a non-linear process in terms of we don't know when schools were going to be open in many countries, and if they are open, they can close back. So we'll have to live with a management of this virus. School will change in the future. Will probably have to be in a more hybrid model, right? Of time that is face to face and time that will have to continue being remote learning. Hence, we need to worry of all these channels, right, and try to do something about. And many countries are starting to do that, right. So one issue that is irrespective of the pandemic is that we need to continue combating gender-based violence in the school system, but in general, that unfortunately is a problem that is dramatically big in the education sector. It's something much larger than what we sometimes recognize. But second, we need to assure that if there is remote learning, that girls have the same access as boys, and there's no discrimination at the school nor at home in terms of access to technology, if there is technology available. And then finally, we need to make sure that girls stay engaged with the education process, right? That there are no increases in school dropouts, either through communications campaigns, through scholarship programs. So that will require further investment, but it's absolutely essential that we work on those two fronts and making sure that they have access to the same opportunities to access quality learning, and at the same time that they re-engage as fast as possible with the education process. So let me leave it at that at this point, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jaime, for giving us that great overview of the situation and explaining to us, I think, some of the major challenges here, not just now, but in the short term and in the long term. Our second speaker is Sonal Desai, who's a demographer who works primarily with social inequalities in developing countries, with a particular focus on gender and class inequalities. She studies inequalities in education, employment, and maternal and child health outcomes by locating them within the political economy of the region. While much of her research focuses on South Asia, she also has engaged in comparative studies across Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So Nalde, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I am just going to start by sharing my screen. Is that okay? Thank you, everyone. I'm sort of going to move from general to particular. Jamie has done a fantastic job. Amy has done a fantastic job of ensuring that we have a sort of a broad overview around different regions and countries at different economic levels. What I'm going to do is try and sort of focus on India and try to draw out some of the implications and questions based on what we have seen in India. The first thing I sort of want to focus on is that the gains to women's education around the world are fragile, but particularly so in Indian context. Excuse me for a moment, I'm just trying to, okay. India has seen a tremendous gain in education for both boys and girls, but the gains have been particularly higher for the girls, resulting in a closing or rapidly closing gap between boys and girls on education. School enrollment is nearly universal for both boys and girls. Proportion of people who complete class 12 at this point in time has been sort of around 33% for children born or boys born in 1980s, whereas it's about 27% for women. So it's really catching up very, very quickly. However, these gains are fragile, okay? Because usually when we think in terms of investment in education, we expect two types of rewards. Either there is a reward in the labor market by which women are able to get better jobs, have higher income, or there are rewards in marriage market in that they might be able to make better marriages. In Indian case, both assumptions remain questionable. What we find is that over time, women's labor force participation in India has been falling. And it has been falling particularly for girls who have received some education, class 6, 10, 11. If you look at the right-hand side of the panel that I'm showing on the graph here, Okay, you'll see that women with no education, about 53% are employed, as opposed to girls with class 10 and 11 education, only 23% are employed. Employment sort of ticks up for women with college graduation, but even then, their employment rate is much smaller than or lower than women with no education or just primary education. Econometric analysis shows that this sort of dip in employment for women with secondary level of education is pretty robust for all women, particularly rural women, even when we control for things like age, number of children, ages of children, caste, religion, etc. So women with education don't seem to have, or at least moderate levels of education, secondary level of education, don't necessarily seem to benefit tremendously in the labor market. There has generally been an assumption that, well, okay, that's fine, but men are getting higher education, they want more educated brides, and hence women are required to have education in order to be able to secure husbands with higher level of education. That doesn't seem to be the case either. Two separate surveys consistently show that there has been a striking increase in number of women who are marrying men with education less than themselves. Okay? For women born in or marriages taking place in 1970s and 80s, less than 10% had women who had higher education than their husbands. Now the proportion is rapidly approaching 20%. So you don't have gains in marriage market, you don't have gains in labor markets. Why is it that the parents might want to educate their daughters? Okay, clearly we are seeing an increase in women's education. I think part of it is an act of faith, that perhaps good things in life will come to them via education. There is a social expectation that families like ours send their daughters to school. School is generally a safe environment for girls, and particularly with rising age at marriage, schools provide a safer outlet for women. Public policies have also tried to encourage girls' education through things like tuition subsidy, scholarship program, and so on. Need for daughters to be caring for their younger siblings has gone down. And most importantly, girls really want to be at school. That's their only real exposure to external world. All of these rationale and assumptions come under strain during an era of COVID-19. What we expect would be that given the kind of school closures we are seeing, given the kind of financial crisis we are seeing, we may see widening of pre-existing divide between girls and boys. Okay? For example, we know that households tend to invest more in more in boys than in girls. We know that girls have greater requirement for caring for their children, girls are caring for their younger siblings. We know that digital access is higher for boys than for girls. There is also the emerging trend in India, at least, where there is a greater enrollment of boys in private schools compared to government schools, which often have better school infrastructure and so on. It seems highly likely that each of this may play out in terms of what happens to the gender inequality in education during this crisis as well as following the crisis. Let me show you some data on each of these issues. First, what we find is that households tend to generally spend more on their sons than on their daughters. The orange bars here show you annual per capita expenditure on boys' education, and the green bars show you annual per capita expenditure on girls' education. And comparing households which are at the lowest income level, okay, incomes of per capita income of about 500 per month, have 500 rupees per month, which is less than $10, okay, And overall expenditure on boys, we see a sharp difference between the expenditures that families make on girls and boys. As we go along the income ladder, we can start seeing that expenditures on girls and boys sort of starts more or less equalizing and catching up. Now, with COVID, if the households sort of fall into a poverty trap and have a sudden income loss, there seems a high likelihood that its impact may actually be greater on expenditures on girls' education than on boys' education. One area of concern. Next area of concern is that if schools are closed and there is a childcare demand for younger siblings, teenage girls may be required to care for their siblings and supervise their homework instead of being able to spend time on their own study and their own homework. They may also not have access to independent space where they can take long distance classes or study. We also know that girls have lower access to digital tools. This is data from 2012, and things may well have changed, but I suspect some of the gender division still remains. Okay? In 2012, interviews of boys and girls aged 15 to 18 showed that about 70% of the boys were able to use SMS or text messaging, compared to about less than 60% for the girls. About 30% of the boys used computers compared to 22% for girls. And in terms of internet access, there was a very sharp divide in that about 22% of the boys had access to internet as opposed to 12% for the girls. Okay? Again, online classes, online education actually may play up some of these pre-existing divides and may further disadvantage girls compared to boys. Something we haven't paid sufficient attention to is that the parental desire to invest in boys' education also translates into higher enrollment for boys in private schools compared to that for the girls. In 2012, for children aged 6 to 14, 31% of the girls were in private schools compared to 38% of the boys. It seems highly possible that private schools are better able to adapt to long distance teaching due to better infrastructure. School survey in 2012 of primary schools in which there were computers available for student use in 2012 showed that among the private schools, 55% had some sort of a computer availability, and among the government schools, only 22% had any kind of a computer available for student use. These differences may translate into a variety of other infrastructure availabilities, which makes it feasible for schools to offer online education. It's also very interesting in that private schools may actually be better positions to adapt to using technology. Government schools, looking at the teachers and their backgrounds in government and private schools, what we find is that the government schools have a tendency to focus on formal certification, whereas private schools are more flexible in what they require. And when I say formal certification, I mean actually people who have a degree or certificate from teacher training programs. Okay? So comparison of teachers in the private and government schools shows that about 70% of the government private school teachers had a college degree as opposed to 57% of the teachers in government schools. But 94% had some sort of a training certification. Basically, without those training certification, you cannot get a government school job. But whether the kind of training that was provided in an in-class classroom sort of a training is useful in an online age is not very clear. Teachers in government schools also tend to be on average about 10 years older than their counterparts in private schools. So again, there are school-based inequalities There are household-based inequalities, and these household-based inequalities sort of intersect with school-based inequalities to create conditions under which girls may be more disadvantaged than their brothers. So what are we facing now? We're basically facing this perfect storm of triple crisis. One, we are dealing with school closures and to some extent online education. We are facing income drop for parents, and it is very substantial. Some of the surveys that we have been doing via telephone in New Delhi metropolitan area shows that about 85% of the households find that their incomes dropped significantly in April and May following the lockdown. And this impact is very large for people in the informal sector. We are also facing a lack of transportation to get to school. We are facing infrastructure bottlenecks. It's very easy to think about India as the fastest growing internet market, and yet the internet access is relatively limited, very unreliable, and most of the people are using their internet via telephone or a smartphone, which if there is only one device in the household or maybe 2 or 3 devices, whether they would be available to girls or not is not very clear. And we are dealing with care needs for younger siblings. So when we start thinking about research in this area, I think we will need to think about both short-term and long-term impacts. Short-term impacts for all children are likely to be negative, but for the reasons I just specified, they may be particularly negative for girls. There is also a life cycle impact. A 5-year-old or a 6-year-old who stays out of school and doesn't pick up early reading, writing skills may be affected very differently from a child who is 14 and 15. So there may be very different sort of life cycle impacts. Some of them may be the age at which the individuals are experiencing the closure and how it sort of continues into their secondary school, tertiary schooling, etc. may be very different depending upon the gender of the child. On the plus sides, though, there is also a possibility that there may be institutional impacts on school infrastructure, training materials, and the kind of training provided that could potentially mitigate some of the gender negativity that we have been talking about so far. One of the biggest things that happened to girls' education in India was institution of long distance college education, where people could get a college degree via correspondence course. And that was something that really had an impact on the ability of girls in rural area to get to college, which they might not have been able to get to otherwise. And their likelihood of completing college really went up. It's possible that if we can build on some of these challenges and come up with good hybrid models or online models of education, it may be that it can moderate some of the negative impacts and over a longer term help reduce rather than increase gender inequalities. Or at least that's my hope. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sonal. And it's very nice to end on that positive note of some possible things that can, positive lessons that can come out of this. Our third speaker is Megan O'Donnell, who's the Assistant Director of Center of Global Development's Gender Program and Senior Policy Analyst. She works on issues related to women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, gender data and measurement, and development effectiveness. And prior to the Center for Global Development, she worked at the One Campaign, an international advocacy organization focused on sub-Saharan Africa, where she led the development of one's gender and inclusive growth-focused policy recommendations to donors and country governments. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sonia. Thanks very much for having me contribute to today's conversation. I'm also going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully you all can see that okay. All right. So I am going to focus over the next few minutes on seeking to complement the very rich information that Jaime and Sonald have already provided, both globally and more specifically within the Indian context, by taking a look at the perspectives of frontline education providers, school operators, and other education program providers, to get a sense for whether the facts and figures we've been discussing really resonate with their perspectives, you know, on the ground, seeking to mitigate some of these risks that we're discussing. The presentation I'll give draws upon collaborative work with two other colleagues sitting at CGD in our education program. That's our education program director, Susanna Harris, and a senior policy analyst, Miriam Akmal. So very grateful to them for the collaboration. We worked on this together. In early April, the three of us got together just as school closures were really ramping up globally to draft a survey that we put out, as I mentioned, to these frontline education service providers. And what we wanted to do was first get a sense for their perceptions on the risks of school closures to children from a gender perspective. So simply getting a sense for what risks they thought may disproportionately impact girls versus boys as schools were closing down. And then secondly, to sort of translate that data and evidence into policy decision-making. Very sorry about the siren in the background, if you can hear that. We wanted to make sure that we were collating that data, we were sort of putting it into one central platform so that we could then communicate our findings and resulting recommendations to governments and the donor institutions that we interface with most frequently. In terms of dissemination, you know, we used our own gender and education mailing lists. We went out through Twitter and other social media platforms, other coalitions that focus on global education, and did some direct outreach to our networks and contacts. And having the survey open for about a month, it was online through just a SurveyMonkey or Google Form platform. We got about 100 individual responses, a little bit more than that, with a pretty broad geographic sweep. So about half of those respondents came in from sub-Saharan African countries. And then the rest of our 32 countries that were represented was a good mix of the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and then also a number of organizations represented that work globally. And we also saw a decent mix of folks who are just operating schools, teachers, principals, administrators, folks with those vantage points, and then also, you know, the nonprofit sphere of international organizations or grassroots organizations that provide gender equality, childcare, or education programming. Our main findings, they fall into three buckets. The first is a focus on these perceived risks that you can see here from a gender perspective. And then I'll also go into a couple of findings on the resources, or rather the resource constraints that these organizations are facing, and also what they're trying to do to mobilize, you know, to mitigate some of these risks for girls and boys. And then I'll end with some recommendations based on those findings. Not surprisingly, to start here, you know, is very consistent with what Jaime and Sonald have already shared. We see that about 69% of respondents anticipate that school closures will more negatively impact girls rather than boys. And the reasons that they cite, because we also asked them to provide comments so we could do a bit of a qualitative assessment too, largely fall into this bucket that was discussed around gender-based violence. 66% of all respondents cite that is something they anticipate being a very important concern in need of being addressed and disproportionately impacting girls. We see relatedly that other responses that cited very important concerns related to harmful traditional practices. So 46% citing early marriage as a risk, a very important concern. 53% of respondents looking to early or unintended pregnancy within adolescence as an important concern, or very important, excuse me. And then 48%, as has been discussed, link this to the fear that girls will not be returning to school. Interestingly, we see some regional differences when we broke down this data a bit by regional context. So to start, with the South Asian context, to follow Sonald, here we see less of a concern from respondents that girls will be getting pregnant, perhaps due to some of the social norms that kind of may be more likely to confine girls to the household or the private sphere. But a higher rate, 35%, feared that the girls would be subject to early marriage, pressures to marry during adolescence. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, in contrast, we see that 71% of sub-Saharan African respondents, where folks based there, feared early pregnancy, very consistent with what Jaime was mentioning around the Ebola case in 2014, only 19% fearing that early marriage concern. So just underscoring the fact that, of course, while we need to speak sort of in broad strokes in order to move through a lot of information quickly, the importance of the context specificity of some of these constraints, largely tied to the pre-existing social norms that surround gender, country by country, context by context. The other concerns outside of GBV and harmful traditional practices, also entirely consistent with what's been mentioned, a lot of discussion of unpaid care work and the likelihood that that is not only magnified in light of COVID as folks may fall sick, but also is just gendered in its nature. And so a lot more of that falling to girls rather than boys. Some discussions of pressures to engage in transactional sex, especially in light of the fact that economic strains are exacerbated during this time, and also pressures that we saw for both girls and boys to engage in paid work in order to provide for their households or support that. I'll say that this is not only consistent with what we've heard from earlier speakers, but also with the evidence base more broadly. We did a recent working paper through CGD, myself, Amber Peterman, and a number of other co-authors who charted the pathways for increased violence against women and children in pandemic and other crisis contexts. And we see, as others have mentioned, increased violence against children, likelihood in part due to that familial stress, that economic strain, and also the transactional sex dimension that I mentioned, very well cited these days paper by Oriana Bandiera and co-authors in the context of Ebola that showed that absent intervention, girls were more likely when they were out of school to spend more time with older men, get pregnant, and then be less likely to return to school. So things that we definitely need to keep on our radar as we turn to policy and investment decision-making in this COVID context. Next area of findings, as I mentioned, is focused on the resource constraints of these organizations, the frontline service providers themselves. And what we found here was probably the area of most surprise for the team of us. We went into this very much expecting that in light of the economic recession, parental unemployment, strains on family resources, that understandably contributions and fees from parents themselves would be decreased. But what we saw was that respondents did not report budget cuts in light of those decreased contributions or fees nearly as much as they were reporting decreases in budget provided by donors, whether private or philanthropic, or multilateral or bilateral. And we saw some notable exceptions. There were a few respondents who specifically gave shout out to philanthropic donors and bilateral donors who've really prioritized support for the education sector during this time. But as you can see here, that wasn't necessarily the norm. And so as a result, a lot of respondents were talking about the need to constrict their staff through layoffs and furloughs, so really tighten their capacity. This we saw was at odds with the efforts that the respondents were seeking to undertake, really trying to ramp up and adjust efficiently to make sure that even though schools are not in session, teachers, principals, administrators, and others are still really providing for students, and especially accounting for some of these gender-specific risks that they perceived. So we see that the overwhelming majority, 89%, of folks who responded to the survey point to these different areas where they are trying to engage with households, with students, with their parents, whether through anti-violence and anti-abuse awareness campaigns, or more directly through phone calls, SMS, other communication, to make sure that students and especially girls are safe during this time within their households. And then they also, cited, in light of economic insecurity, the desire to serve and an intention to serve as sort of a port of call for basic essential resources. So whether that's soap and food and sanitation products, wanting to make sure that in addition to at-home learning, they're also providing for basic needs. So in light of all of this, we have a couple of fairly straightforward recommendations, but that are currently easier said than done, certainly. The first really focuses on what we've called funder humility. And this is, where we want to reconcile what we perceive as sort of a current tension between these education service providers on the front lines, ramping up their efforts, needing additional support in order to do that most successfully to meet children's needs and address these gender-specific risks, while in parallel seeing some of these budget cuts. And of course, it is a very fiscally strained environment, as many folks have understandably sought to rally to address the immediate health effects of the pandemic. But as myself and many other CGD colleagues have been discussing in various fora, we anticipate that the indirect effects are going to be that much more significant over the long run. And I think Jaime and Sinald have really made that case as well. So this is where we just want to see sort of a strengthening of the partnership that's happening between donors and governments who are supporting these education frontline actors and these actors themselves, to make sure that there's a full awareness of their needs and their constraints, and that decision-making is informed by it. And the second piece that you see here, this applies not just to donors and funders and governments, but also to the providers themselves. And this is a real desire to make sure that as they are rallying to make these quick decisions, that they are, to the extent possible, really drawing upon rigorous evidence and taking a data-driven approach to be using intervention models that we know work, that we know are likely to be context-specific and therefore able to be effective in benefiting students. Some discussions around safe spaces, making sure that girls, whether virtually or otherwise, have a social network that is supportive of them and sort of keeping tabs on their safety and security and well-being. And a lot of discussion, as has been flagged already, about the need to really incentivize parents who otherwise would be more resistant to prioritizing girls' education to really prioritize investment there when schools and as schools are reopening. So whether it's through school feeding programs or the provision of uniforms and materials, or even just the conditional cash transfers that, during times of economic duress could incentivize parents to take those payments to ensure that then girls are being prioritized to get back into the classroom. These are approaches that we want on programmers' radar. I think both of these areas, and of course the survey itself, present opportunities for future research and evaluation by think tanks and academics like us. I mentioned at the very beginning that this survey was pretty early on. We launched it April 8th, so just as school closures were ramping up. So I think there would be ample opportunity to do something like this exercise in sort of a recurring fashion, to the extent that we can assess whether these perceived risks that respondents have cited have played out, and how some of their programming decisions have evolved, and also gauge the extent to which resource constraints have either worsened or been ameliorated. So with that, thank you all so much for participating today, for listening, and I'll hand it back over to Sonia.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us those numbers, and also some really great ideas for how to push on some practical solutions to this. So our fourth panelist is Tracy Evans, who has been working for the Agricon Foundation of Canada in Ottawa since 2015 as an education program manager, managing a portfolio of gender-responsive education programs across East and West Africa and in Central Asia that cuts across the lifelong ladder of learning, from early childhood education through to post-secondary education. So Tracy, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. Just gonna set up my screen. It's not giving me my slides as an option. Sorry, just 1 second. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this panel on a topic that is of extreme relevance to the Agricon Foundation and to all of the communities in which we're working with right now as we try to respond to COVID-19 and specifically the impacts that it's having on girls' education. I think it actually flows very well for me to come in maybe at the end of this panel, as my hope is to spend the next few minutes talking a little bit about specifically what we as a civil society organization on the ground and working on the front lines have been doing to support our communities throughout this transition period. And I think it's worth kind of starting with the recognition that as soon as the COVID-19 pandemic hit and schools started closing, there was an immediate recognition that this was going to have massive implications on learners across the world, but really on none more so than on female learners and on learners living in marginalized and vulnerable communities who are often excluded from the best of what education has to offer. And so while so many communities have turned to Khan Academy or to Zoom classrooms as a means of seeing their way through and keeping learning going throughout the pandemic, these are the communities that were really most vulnerable to being left behind or to falling behind. And so in response to that, organizations like the Agricon Foundation and a lot of our partners on the ground have been working tirelessly since March to address all of these impacts on education and specifically girls' education. And our first priority really was to keep learning going throughout school closures while children were staying at home, and to make sure that all of our responses were being directly responsive to girls and their specific needs. So across a lot of our implementation countries, most of our teams on the ground have been working to repurpose existing educational materials. And this is a huge advantage that we've had, is that we weren't starting from scratch. We already had a lot of content to work with, and it was really just about adapting it to an at-home and kind of self-directed learning style that we could then have children work with from the household. That said, we know, and we've heard from many of our speakers, that when it comes to household responsibilities and burdens, these are often far more likely to fall on girls and women and to increase throughout the COVID pandemic. And therefore, it's not a safe assumption to make that we can drop off at-home learning packages and think that boys and girls are going to benefit from them in the same way. And so addressing this head on in the unequal distribution of household burdens is always a concerted focus of Agricon Foundations. But now that we know that girls no longer have a classroom to go to every single day, and that they no longer have a safe space in which they're recognized as a learner instead of a daughter, responding to this has been more important than ever. And so with that in mind, beyond just dropping off at-home learning packages, we've also made significant investments in awareness and sensitization campaigns across our communities to help encourage parents to foster a space and a spirit of learning at the household level for both boys and girls. And those awareness campaigns are really contextual, and what they look like kind of depends on the context. It might mean posters within a public market, or it might mean radio broadcasting commercials. In some communities, to kind of supplement the at-home, or we've been developing, we've been supporting teachers to do at-home visits where they visit each of their students on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, always following COVID safety protocols. And we use this as an opportunity to check in with students to see how they're progressing academically and make sure that they're not facing any bottlenecks in their at-home learning. But also to have a conversation with parents and kind of reiterate some of these important gender equality messages, to hear from them on, how are your daughter and your son learning, and to reiterate the importance of making sure that girls have equal time to put towards their studies that boys do. To supplement all of this, we've also been building the capacity of teachers to do all of this important work, using SMS messaging, WhatsApp, or conference calls, any platform that really makes sense for the country or the context, because we recognize that so many of the skill sets that we're asking of teachers right now are new to them. At-home learning, distance learning, and even going door to door and having these really intimate conversations with parents are things that are very new, and we want to make sure that teachers feel supported to take on these new roles and responsibilities, especially at a time when teachers themselves are dealing with the stress and the impacts of COVID-19 on a personal basis. On this next slide, I just wanted to show a couple examples of what awareness and sensitization looks like. These are posters from our Indian colleagues who were doing awareness campaigns on the importance of girls' education. And as you can see, we're kind of balancing using illustrative and written messaging to reach both literate and illiterate families on these key and important points. And then the sensitization that we've been doing within our communities goes beyond just focusing on academic success and making sure that learners are learning, but also addressing the significant increase in domestic violence that we've heard so much about today and just in the news lately as a result of COVID-19. And so the campaigns take a different form depending on what we're talking about. So for instance, in rural and remote regions of Afghanistan, we've had our project teams and education leaders like teachers calling parents and community leaders to have a discussion about the potential risk of increased domestic violence during this time, and to talk about various coping and mitigation measures that could be put in place if these parents and households feel that these are kind of risks that they're seeing within their own house. In northern Uganda, starting next week, we're taking a different approach. We're not only leveraging radio broadcasting to deliver at-home learning classes through the radio for kids in a fun and engaging way to keep them learning, but we're also going to do radio talk shows where parents have the opportunity to call in and ask any questions that they may have about coping with COVID-19 and also supporting their children to continue learning at home. And then another measure that we're putting in place in some of our countries where it's been feasible is to set up a safeguarding hotline for communities, including children, to call into and report incidences of domestic violence if they're experiencing those. And these are being run by trained staff who are equipped to have these very difficult, sensitive conversations, and as relevant, depending on the context, to provide referrals to additional support or shelter or social services, depending on the needs of the caller. And so while our immediate need or priority has been focusing on keeping learning going at the household level, we've also really quickly had to pivot toward our attention towards supporting schools as they reopen, which in certain countries is already happening. And the interventions that we're doing to help this really vary depending on the context. In some instances, we're helping schools to develop much more robust water, sanitation, and hygiene measures, including putting additional measures in place to help girls with menstrual hygiene management. And we've been supporting the development of remedial classes to help children catch up on lost learning, which will be particularly important for girls who did not have the ability to study as much as boys, perhaps at the household level. In addition, we know that the longer that schools are closed, the less likely it is that some girls will be able to re-enroll and that they're going to face significant additional barriers to getting back to school. We've heard about this from the Ebola crisis in 2014, and we know that that's already happening as a result of COVID. And so, you know, countries like Kenya are already announcing that schools will not reopen until 2021. And as we hear how long the gap is going to be in school closures, we know that we have more work to do than ever to reach out to parents and make sure that they're not putting additional barriers to getting their girls back into school, like for instance, by supporting early child marriage. We want to make sure that we're iterating the point that boys and girls education is equally valuable, because we know that some families are going to be facing very difficult financial hardships and are going to have to perhaps make some decisions around which children do and don't re-enroll. And we want to make sure that girls have an equal chance at getting back into school. And of course, we continue to iterate the importance of letting girls study from home so that when they do get back into school, they're not and behind with their peers. We also know that once schools reopen, a lot of governments are going to put in additional measures to make sure that children do catch up. And some of these measures direct implications on learners, are going to have direct implications on girls specifically. For instance, in countries like Tanzania, we know that they're adding a few additional hours to every school day, which is a well-intentioned response, of course, to helping children catch up, but it could have direct implications on girls who are expected to go straight home after school to do their additional chores, or for instance, by making them go to school a lot earlier or staying a lot later, and then being on the road during hours that are perhaps dangerous to be walking to and from school, and that could potentially lead to increased risk of sexual violence. So we're going to be working with our communities to understand the implications of these additional measures and making sure that we think through strategies to help keep girls safe as they go back to school. In addition, in relation to our work on back to school, one challenge that some of our country teams are already facing is around the fact that some schools are reopening their doors perhaps too soon. And as much as we want all children back in the classroom yesterday, quite frankly, we also want to make sure that all the safety measures that need to be put in place are being put in place when children get back to school. And so if governments do reopen doors at a time that we feel might be unsafe, we face a difficult challenge of wanting to encourage parents to keep their kids learning, whilst not wanting to advise to send them to a classroom that may be dangerous for their own well-being. So in those instances, really, we turn our attention towards helping the government to increase its COVID-19 response measures and bringing social distancing into the classroom, heightening their WASH standards, while continuing to develop high quality at-home learning resources for children to benefit from. So our response has been largely funded through two approaches. In some instances, we've had supportive donors who've allowed us to redirect some of our existing funding from current projects towards a rapid COVID response. For instance, in Afghanistan, Aga Khan Foundation leads the largest Girls Education Challenge program as part of a consortium. And there we've been working closely with the government of Afghanistan to roll out a new radio program that supports children to learn from home through the radio. But we've also been working on accessible educational resources that are available to children who may not have access to all digital technologies like the radio or television. And these are often kids who are in the most remote regions, working through the public school system, and are often left behind in situations like these. In partnership with Global Affairs Canada, our East African Education Program, Foundations for Learning, has developed a robust 6-month emergency COVID response plan that is now allowing our communities to quickly pivot towards adapting to this new context. And then in other instances, we have been able to pursue additional funding that's been put out and released specifically to respond to COVID-19 impacts on education. But I would say that for all of the talk that we've heard about the gravity of the situation and the impacts on the ground, the general funding made available specifically to civil society stakeholders to respond to this crisis has not kept up with the need. And then when designing all of these new programs or redesigning existing programs, for us, it's extremely important to make sure that the voices of the communities that we're trying to reach and who are supposed to benefit from these programs are being brought to the table and are being heard and included as part of that design process. But that's actually been increasingly difficult to do as part of the COVID measures that have prevented us from hosting focus group discussions and in-person consultations the way we normally would. A lot of our human-centered design practices have become increasingly challenging. Communities are harder to reach, and so many of the digital platforms that a lot of other researchers and organizations are using are just not accessible to the very rural communities and stakeholders that we are trying to reach. In addition, these consultations would bring up questions of safeguarding and consent, because we recognize that now the community members who we're trying to talk to are actually taking these calls from within their own household, which puts them perhaps at increased risk, recognizing that these are pretty sensitive conversations that we're asking them to have. And so one of the strategies that we've used to adapt to this is to really work through local civil society stakeholders and teams on the ground who have very close ties and connections with these communities, who are trusted allies of the communities, and therefore are able to assess who they can consult with, what the best way is to reach them, and to make sure that those respondents are safe in doing so. Before I close, I did just want to take a moment to share here a suite of resources that Aga Khan Foundation has developed in response to COVID-19. These are all available for free and online, and the web link for accessing them is going to be shared in the group chat. So if any of these titles or topics is of interest to you or any of your colleagues, I would certainly encourage you to check them out, and please share them widely. They're free and available for everyone to benefit from. And so as I move towards the end, I just had kind of 3 closing remarks that I wanted to hone in on. The first is around kind of a localization agenda, and just recognizing that so much of the work that we've been able to do as the Aga Khan Development Network over the past 4 months is the result of the fact that the vast majority of our teams and our staff on the ground are locals and nationals. And I think that when the pandemic hit, these people who kind of stayed on the front lines and kept the wheels turning on all of our projects, making sure that the work was getting done. And so, you know, it really goes to reiterate the point that investing in local permanent institutions is so important for preparing for when a crisis emerges. And these are the stakeholders who are going to see the programming through. So for all of our staff globally, and then all of the teachers and the educational leaders who've been showing up for work every single day to keep kids learning, even while coping with COVID-19 themselves, I know myself and my colleagues are extremely grateful. My second point is around the research implications of everything that we've just discussed. I think the urgent nature of the COVID-19 crisis meant that for a lot of organizations, we were going into uncharted territory, trying to reprogram very quickly. And as my boss likes to say, we were kind of building the plane as we were flying it. And so, you know, one of the most common cases that we constantly hear about is a comparison of what we can expect the impacts of COVID to be on girls' education is the Ebola crisis from 2014, which is a very helpful comparison and analogy, no doubt. But I think that its overall scope was a lot smaller than what we're currently dealing with. So, you know, the breadth of countries that have been impacted by COVID, the length of school closures that are going to vary from one country to the next, and then the diversity of approaches that governments are taking up to promote distance learning. All of this diversity really presents us with a bit of an organic, real-time randomized control trial across the entire world on what does and does not work to support continued school learning through a global shutdown of schools. And so for me, the ability to compare the application and the impact of these divergent approaches is going to be, it's going to provide us with a lot of rich and relevant information and data to draw from. And I'm very excited to see what kind of research emerges from all of that. And then my last note before I close is just around the significance of this pandemic on girls' education specifically. I think that the entire global education community over the past 10 years has done a lot of good work and progress towards promoting girls' education and closing the gap in enrollment and making sure that gender equality goes beyond just headcounts, but actually making sure that girls are learning in schools. But then as soon as COVID hit, we all recognized that we were at much of a risk of reversing all of the progress that had been made. So right now we're at a bit of a crossroads, I think. We have the risk that when schools reopen, we're going to lose so many of those gains. And to be honest, you know, for some girls, those losses are already being felt. There are girls who have become pregnant or forced into marriage as a result of COVID, whose educational pathways have come to a halt. And that may become an even bigger reality unless we act now. Or we have the opportunity actually to seize this moment and make our global education system more inclusive than it's ever been. There have never been more eyes on school re-enrollment and on back to school campaigns than there are right now. And I think we have a unique opportunity to leverage that to promote more inclusive education systems and even further promote the global gender equality in and through education agenda. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tracy, for giving us a sense of how you as an organization have dealt with this on the ground. So we now have, I think, about 12 minutes for question and answer. I will let Leva Rouhani moderate that. So Leva, I will give you the mic, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in the Q&A chat box. We do have a couple questions coming through, and I'm going to open up to the panel. We have a couple questions around connectivity. So I'll just read them before I make them go live. So one of the questions that have come through is, you know, as Mr. Jaime and other panelists mentioned, how can we support the issue of connectivity? The issue of access and connectivity to devices does not guarantee necessarily that girls will have access to internet because, as we mentioned, they could be busy doing chores. So while their brothers are using the internet, they might not have access. So how can we support that? What should we do? Another question around connectivity is, what about those without connectivity or those with subpar connectivity? Will this just reinforce the divide between urban and rural communities, particularly for women and girls whose needs are more acute in rural communities. And I'll end this round of questions with one more question where it says, there's an assumption that everybody can just move online. However, we know there's an existing digital gender divide, which risks to further marginalize girls. How do we expect girls who are just trying to survive to afford expensive data to get online? And I'll open it up to the panelists.
Let me start by talking about some of the questions that surround the internet access and digital divide. I think one of the most interesting outcome of the GROW research that was funded by IDRC Canada that Sonia mentioned from the beginning was that sometimes gender outcomes can be modified by non-gendered policies. Okay. And I think this is one of the most important examples where all of a sudden we recognize that having access to internet and cheap internet is very important. And countries are going to have to start rethinking the models through which they both provide internet access and the way they get priced. Okay. All of a sudden, then we can start thinking about internet as a common property resource rather than individual resource, where a certain amount of internet connectivity should be available for public good, as opposed to downloading YouTube videos or Netflix and so on. Suddenly we will have to start rethinking how the internet frequencies are allocated to private sector use, government sector use, school use, and so on. So rethinking the allocation of a common property resource in order to equalize the access of the most marginalized people, including poor girls, okay, is something that we are going to have to start thinking about far more concretely than we have so far. This is one area where I think there is an intersection between gendered needs and broader development sector needs. Thank you.
So I can come in just to sort of complement, very much echo first and foremost what Sonal just shared about the fact that sometimes these more gender neutral solutions, sort of universal or all-encompassing solutions, can be the way forward to ensure we're reaching women and girls as well. I think earlier in the discussion, we also flagged that sometimes it's the infrastructural or affordability constraint that we have to tackle. And I think Sonal's recommendation really addresses those very well. At times, it's not an affordability issue, but it's a gender norms issue where social pressures, discriminatory values, and ideas within a household are constraining girls, even where internet is available, as the question reflects, to not have the time to make full use of it because they're engaged in other activities, domestic work, or there's a perceived security threat by parents or household members that feel that girls shouldn't have equal access to these resources. So I think when we think about the gender norm side, there are no short-term sort of quick fixes or easy answers, but I do think about the literature on how to sort of nudge behavior change. So some really interesting evidence on media messaging. I mean, Tracy's flagged the importance of radio. I think we've also seen these other studies about the importance of TV. Eliana La Ferreira in Brazil talking about telenovelas as an opportunity to shift social norms, right, and change perceptions and attitudes about appropriate behaviors, especially for young girls. I think that's really an area that could be explored further, especially within this context where we are socially distant and we are really reliant on those technologies and those media platforms. And then, of course, when it's safe, organizations like Pro Mundo, who engage more directly within communities and within households to shift norms around masculinity and femininity, and these male engagement programs that can really have a role not just on the digital divide front that are shifting gender norms about what's appropriate in terms of access to technology, but also in terms of unpaid care work and gender-based violence and some of these other issues we flagged.
I guess I would just jump into kind of expand on that, not to move away from the digital agenda, but just to stress, especially from my perspective, some of the regions that Aga Khan Foundation works in, COVID-19 and many other reasons to move towards a digital educational approach, like it's not going to happen overnight, despite as much as we would like it to, and as much as the need is certainly there. It's just not relevant in some of our contexts. And so there is really the need of making sure that we're responding in a way that is contextually relevant to each of our countries, each of our contexts, even within a country. I mean, one district or province to the next can have dramatically different realities. And so I think that as much as possible, when technology is available, ensuring that it's equally available to girls and boys, and that it's, you know, being delivered to the right bandwidth is necessary. We have to come to terms with the fact that right now as it stands, that's not a reality globally, and in countries where it's not possible, or in contexts where it's not possible, we need to make sure that the resources that we are delivering are responsive to the needs of those communities. And sometimes it is the most basic, you know, printed material being hand delivered, and then having a phone call to follow up and answer any questions.
So let me just complement what Tracy, Megan, and Sonal has said on making 2 points. One is that we're talking about a digital divide for many years already. So this is kind of a slap in the face. So look, you were talking about a digital divide. There was a digital divide. It was not closed. There you go. And we are now living the consequences, right? I'm not being able to reach most children. Now, I think now it's clear that part of the homework on education, not all, but part of the homework is eliminating that digital divide. But that has many aspects. And I think those have been mentioned by Sonal and Megan, which are, well, we need to worry about hardware. Kids should have a device, ideally a tablet, and not only a smartphone, each kid, right? So it's the issue within household matters. Second, the tablet has to have something inside, right? So software matters, but it's not the problem that we face is not at the availability of technological solutions, digital solutions, digital platforms, is creating a market such that countries can buy this in an effective way with the right information, with the right procurement process. So the homework that we have on the software side is a homework of thickening that market, right? And making that market much more transparent and more accessible to governments and to people. Third, we have the issue of pricing in general, and pricing of connectivity and the pricing of software as well, right? We're talking in some countries that make progress with zero rates, which is great, right? But not all countries. And fourth, we have an issue of culture, because maybe you have the right price, you have the right software, you have the right hardware, but girls are not using it. Why? Because of an issue of culture, right? And it's there where I see issues between boys and girls in terms of what's the parents' perception of how they should be engaged to the connectivity and through the internet, but also between urban and rural, right? Not necessarily all rural communities are saying, yes, we will embrace education through internet. Not necessarily. That might not happen. And there are many, in both in South Asia and in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, we do see sometimes resistance to that. So closing the digital divide is complicated, but we have to do it. And the second point I wanted to make is that I think it's very good that many governments actually have recognized. They see the reality. They have recognized that remote learning cannot be about online. With online in Latin America, you reach 50% of children. In Sub-Saharan Africa, you reach 10% of children. South Asia is the same thing, right? So actually, fortunately, most of the attempts of mitigating the negative impacts of the pandemic have been through multi-platform solutions, combining online with WhatsApp networks, with radio, TV, etc., which very different degrees of effectiveness, of course, and very different degrees of depth of those interventions. And in many countries, we're going to see that the mitigation is going to be very small. But with a lot of variations across countries and within countries. But the other thing that allows us to see is that, like it or not, TV and radio, they're back. And actually, they are absolutely critical. And as Tracy was mentioning, in the case of Afghanistan, I think we reached by radio, or that's it. And even radio, not all households will have a radio. We have the device. So even that we need to improve. But TV and radio are back. So mass media is back in the sense that we need to recognize, and they have to recognize, that they are part of the education process, like it or not, right? So mass media is part of the education engagement of children and of young people. And they are absolutely critical in terms of supporting these changes in culture that we need. And I think this is one of the lessons of this pandemic, right? For mass media to say, look, I mean, you like it or not, this is not an issue of ratings, and it's only a commercial issue. Like it or not, you're part of the education process of all countries. So I think we have several lessons, and if we work on those lessons, I think we can move to a better system. Over.
Okay.
Over to you, Sonia.
Great, thank you. So this has been really fantastic. We're unfortunately out of time. This has been just such a tremendously rich discussion. I know that there's a number of questions still out there, but on behalf of WedLab, let me just extend a huge thank you to all four of you for participating to such an informative and important discussion, and for joining us today. As well, of course, to the audience who has signed in from around the world. So thank you very much for that. Do stay in touch through our Twitter handle. We'll be announcing when the recordings of this and previous webinars are posted, and Leva has just put up the website there. And just a quick plug for our next webinar, which is on the topic of social protection programs in the context of gendered impacts of COVID, which is, Leva, remind me, that is on the 23rd, is it?
That's correct.
The 23rd. So stay tuned for that. We have an exciting panel for that as well. So on that note, thank you all very much. And we look forward to continuing this conversation online and offline. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sonia. Thanks, everyone.